Major League Pickleball just completed the first ever free agency draft in league history. Teams came together and spent 1.65 million points, which are just dollars but more confusing, to fill out their rosters for 2025 and beyond. The St. Louis Shock and the Dallas Flash spent money early and they will be running their teams back, but other players like Riley Newman, Jack Sock, James Ignatowicz, Leah Jansen, Quang Duong are all going to be finding a new home for 2025. Two teams entered the draft with 0 players and took completely different approaches. And with the conclusion of the draft, the next trade window is already open and active. We have seen 2 blockbuster trades. We're going to recap every single pick, what every single team did, all the trades we've seen, all the trades we might see. We're going to have some fun with charts. We're going to do it all right here. So please be sure to like this video and subscribe. Let's not waste any time. Let's dive right into the action. So this draft will follow the exact same format that we saw in the 2024 draft where these teams were initially drafted. We'll be using the dynamic bidding system, bidding points, even though they're just dollars. There are no free points provided by the league this time. And one other note is that now that rosters have expanded to 6 players, you have 4 starters, and then your 5th and 6th players are kind of considered your subs. Teams are not allowed to draft a 5th or 6th player until all 16 teams already have 4 players. So the draft is effectively broken up into kind of 2 sections here, the starters and then the subs. The very first selection went for 130,000 points, and it was won by the St. Louis Shock. They took Kate Fahey, that's right, they are running it back. They came up short, losing in the semifinals to the eventual champs Dallas Flash last year, but they decided they liked the team enough to run it back. Now, it would have cost St. Louis just $8.5 thousand to keep Kate Fahey. She went for $130,000 here, so the increased roster cost to St. Louis is $121.5 thousand. Now, if they instead would have dropped Gabe Tardio, who cost $92.5 thousand to keep, he would have had to go for 214,000 points to make up that same incremental roster cost. Based on the prices we're going to see for some of these other men later, Riley Newman, James Ignatowicz, Jack Sock, Quang Duong, I really don't think Gabe would have gone for over 200,000 points. I think it's safe to say that St. Louis probably made the wrong decision with who they dropped, but at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. They got exactly the team they wanted. They may have just spent a little bit more money than they needed to do it. The second selection was made by the Dallas Flash, and much like St. Louis, they just decided to run it back. They spent 100,000 points, and they got Augie Gubb back. Up next was the Columbus Sliders. They spent 110,000 points on Leah Jansen. This rounds out their starting 4 of Andre Diascu, CJ Klinger, Paris Todd, and now Leah Jansen. This is a completely new look for the Columbus Sliders. The 4th pick was Riley Newman, 110,000 points to the DC Pickleball team. DC dropped James Ignatowicz, who would have cost well over $200,000 to keep, and they add Riley Newman for $110,000. And speaking of James Ignatowicz, he was the next player off the board. For 90,000 points, the Chicago Slice took him. And guess what? He was the first player on their roster. None of the players that Chicago Slice had on their team when they were promoted from Challenger to Premier were eligible keepers. None of them were signed to a UPA deal, so they all had to be dropped. Starting from scratch, I didn't really think Chicago would come in like this, but we're going to see a lot from them early. So they're starting with James Ignatowicz as their number 1 building block for their team. They have no other players. The 7th pick was Quang Duong going to the LA Mad Drops. LA has a solid foundation of a team. It's just very unfortunate for them that Thomas Wilson has not been available. The 8th pick was the first big surprise, and this was the New Jersey Fives, who dropped Mari Humberg, so they need a woman. They took Jeannie Bouchard for 90,000 points. For now, this is Annalie Waters, Jeannie Bouchard, Zane Navratil, and Will Howes, but Jeannie Bouchard will be the first player that we see traded. More on that later after the draft recap. Chicago Slice took the 9th and 10th picks for 80,000 points each. They selected Vivian David and Max Freeman. Max Freeman just had a big week at the PPA Tour in Cape Coral, and he's very good buddies with James Ignatowicz. You put them together, you have Vivian David, who's a very talented right side player, and all of a sudden, Chicago actually has a passable team. They've gone from 0 to 3 players, and you could kind of see what they're going for. With the 11th pick, we had another challenger team get into the mix. This was the Atlanta Bouncers, and they selected, for 70,000 points, Victoria DeMuzio. And this was a name I wasn't familiar with, but as you may be aware, me and Eric Tice from the team hosted a draft live stream on this channel, and here's what Eric had to say about this pick.
It is Victoria DeMuzio.
Okay.
Now, Listen, guys, a lot of you don't know who Victoria DiMuzio is. She's a junior college player or junior tennis player from Canada. She's 26. She has a very high duper because she played in the Canadian National Pickleball League. I've seen her at 3 PPA events. I'm very high on her. She likes the left side. Very athletic, has a lot of power.
The 12th player off the board was Callie Smith for 70,000 points to the Chicago Slice. That's right. Chicago Slice went from 0 players to 4 players in the first 12 picks. They finished out their starting 4 before teams like the Texas Rangers have even made a single pick and finished out their starting 4. There's also the New York Hustlers out there who still don't have a player, and Chicago's already taken 4. The 13th pick was another bit of a head scratcher for me just because I was not familiar with this player. The Utah Black Diamonds select Mevish Safdar, and once again, let's go to Eric Tice from our live stream.
She plays at Indiana. She's a PhD candidate there, and now she's a member of the Utah Black Diamonds. She does like the left side. She plays the left side almost exclusively, so I'm guessing she'll play with Tyler on the left and mixed. I really like this pick. Good value there. Great pick.
With the 14th pick, the Texas Rangers finally filled out their roster. With 50,000 points, they selected Noah Cliff. However, once again, there will be a trade here. Stay tuned for that. Finally, with the 15th and 16th pick, the New York Hustlers, who were the other team with 0 players, got on the board. They took Zane Ford and Donald Young for 30,000 and 40,000 points, respectively. 2 very athletic men who are good. Zane especially is very good in singles, but I don't think this is going to be a top-tier men's team. This just kind of feels like a challenger team to me. The Miami Pickleball team selected Maya Bowie, another name I was not familiar with, plus the addition of Jay DeVilliers a few picks later. Orlando Squeeze selected Samantha Parker as their 4th starter. The New York Hustlers got back in the mix, selecting Helena Spiritus and Dominique Schaefer as their 2 women. Carolina Pickleball Club at the 22nd pick selected Tammy Emmerich. This is interesting because they have Ben Johns. They have so much of their roster capital tied up in him, yet they seem so unwilling to spend on the supporting cast around him. This was the minimum amount that they could have spent, 10,000 points. And while she's a great player, I just think with a little extra money, they could really take this team to the next level. The last 2 starters taken were by the SoCal Hard Eights, and they selected Ivan Jakovlevich and Ryan Fu. So now we have starting lineups for every team. The rest of the picks were all subs. I'm not going to go line by line on these, but there are a few interesting ones I want to call out. First of all, Michael Lloyd to the Texas Rangers. Maybe not quite there in doubles, but in singles, certainly talented. We've seen the big upsets. He took down Ben Johns last year. I'm a big believer in Eric Lang. I think he could be a starter on one of these teams easily. And interestingly enough, the LA Mad Drops did select Thomas Wilson. However, they would later put him on IR, meaning he cannot play this year, and fill his spot with Wes Burrows. I know we're going to want to take a look at all of these rosters, but first let's have a little bit of fun with charts. Now, Basil, the first chart that we're going to look at here is going to be showing us just how much each team spent either in the keepers or in the free agency auction portion of the draft. We can see that there really is a pretty noticeable drop-off right after the Chicago Slice. They're also a massive outlier in the sense that they had 0 players coming in, and they by far spent the most of any team in this free agency draft. We also see the other 3 Challenger League teams down here at the bottom. We also can see the 2 Premier League teams that maybe aren't quite as committed to putting in the capital to have a competitive team. For our next chart, we have got PPA rank points. This is the points that a player has earned on the PPA Tour in the last 12-month window. This is used for seeding in PPA tournaments. I'm just taking a weighted average, 45% mixed doubles, 45% gender doubles, and 10% singles. We've got that here on the y-axis. Then down here on the x-axis, I just kind of have players sorted into buckets. I have all of the keepers here sorted by their draft costs. So we have at the very top Ben Johns and Annalie Waters. Then all the way down here, we get our first highlighted segment where we have some challenger keepers. These are cheap players who don't have as much points as some of the other players in Premier League, but still have value just by nature of being so cheap. We then get into the free agency draft section. We can see there just wasn't a whole lot of top-level talent in this draft. After the Jack Sox, Riley Newmans, James Ignatowicz's, Leia Jansen's were off the board, it just started to get pretty thin pretty fast. As we move along into the substitutes, again, just not a whole lot of value to be found. There is one outlier here. This was Thomas Wilson. He does have a lot of PPA rank points still. However, he has since been placed on IR. He will not be able to play this year. And then moving on further down, we get into the Challenger League section where we have a few players who are stuck in Challenger despite having quite a bit of PPA points. We have players like Pablo Tejas. We have Mari Humberg, players who definitely belong on a Premier League roster, but they're stuck here. And these players could be potential trade targets for Premier League teams who want to bolster their rosters in the coming weeks. Real quick, here's the same exact chart, only now we have a logarithmic scale on the y-axis, less dead space on this chart, telling you the same information. Also, just take a quick note, this isn't a perfect system because players like Will Howes don't really play much on the PPA Tour. Moving on, we have another way to visualize all 120 players on Major League Pickleball, Premier League, and Challenger rosters in 2025. All the orange dots are going to be Premier League players, and the blue dots are Challenger players, where once again, we can see Pablo Tejas is a 17th ranked player by this metric, yet he's stuck in Challenger League. For a league that seems so concerned about competitive imbalance, it's kind of funny to me that we have these players stuck in Challenger League when they clearly could perform at a Premier League level. Basil. Moving along now, we've got a chart. Once again, PPA points here on the y-axis, and on the x-axis, we just have the price that they went for either as a keeper or in the recent free agency draft. Now, a few players I want to specifically talk about here are Riley Newman, James Ignatowicz, and Jack Sock. These players on their keeper prices would have been further out here in this area for about $250,000 each. With the new prices that they went for in the free agency draft, they definitely just feel more in line with the overall trend here. In fact, here's a chart I had shared previously showing their MLP 2024 games won versus their keeper price. And again, they stood out as kind of fitting the same archetype of left side men that are just too expensive for what you got for them. But once again, with their new free agency prices, their production feels much more in line with the price. Now, flipping back to this chart, once again, there's a whole lot going on down in here. This is where the bulk of the selections were made, and can't really see what's going on, so let's zoom in just a little bit. Again, we can see our Challenger players that really stand out here. Pablo Tejas, Mari Humberg. Colin Johns is an interesting one as he has a lot of PPA points and he's very cheap, but he's kind of a specialist. He fits the role well next to Ben, but that's just another way that this method isn't perfect. We're going to zoom in one more time, and I'm going to use that opportunity to tell you all about the Austin Pickle Ranch, 16 indoor courts here in Austin, Texas. If you're in town, be sure to check it out, either a membership or drop in play. Boom, sponsor. For the final section of this video, we're going to go through every single team's roster. We're going to be assigning them an off-season grade as well as putting them in the Power Rankings preseason tier list. We've also got a composite grade from other pickleball pundits such as Todd Boss, who writes at Forbes, Eric Tice, who you've seen on this channel and who writes over at The Dink, Jim Kloss over at pickleball.com, Alex Lance from The Kitchen, the NML blogging boys, who are back, by the way, from a stint as the GMs of the New York Hustlers. They're back on the blogging side of things. Welcome back. Of course, my rankings, and then the composite grade here. Now, do keep in mind, my grades are kind of more holistic off-season grade, whereas the rest of these are just draft grades, and they also were written before we saw the two trades, but still, I think it's interesting to see what other people thought about these moves. But before we do that, if you've made it this far, once again, please do consider liking this video and subscribing to this channel. It would be greatly appreciated, and maybe even drop me a comment. Sometimes it gets a little lonely down there. First up, we have the Atlanta Bouncers. I'm giving them a B for their offseason. The composite grades come in at a B-. They have Vivian Glosman, Jaume Martinez-Vick, and Todd Fote, and then they drafted Victoria DiMuzio as their fourth starter, their second woman. We know what we're going to get from Vic and Glosman. I'm a little more skeptical on Todd Fote. He's been in Challenger League for the last couple of years. This will be his first time in Premier, but Premier League is a little bit watered down, so maybe I'm wrong here. And then I just don't have a good scout on Victoria DiMuzio, so I didn't feel comfortable putting them higher than the D tier, which means I do think this team will not be in the playoff mix. The Carolina Pickleball Club, I'm giving their offseason a C just because we already talked about this, but they just aren't really putting in the money around Ben to get him the supporting cast that could really make this team an absolute juggernaut. That said, I do like Tammy Emmerich. If you're going to spend $10,000, that's about as good as you can do. I like that pick a lot for the value. The composite grades come in around a C-. We had a few Ds from Tice and from Boss. Lance over at the kitchen gave this a B-. And again, we just have to take into consideration the Ben and Colin effort level. That said, anytime you have Ben Johns on the roster, it really feels like the C tier is kind of the floor. I have them just as a mid team. They will be competitive. They will win some games against some good teams. They'll lose some games against some bad teams. But ultimately, they're going to fall short of the playoffs. Here we have the first of our promoted Challenger League teams. These are the teams that were in Challenger League that finished top 4 last year, so they got promoted to Premier League. They were allowed to keep any players they drafted for $0, assuming they were eligible, but as we talked about, Chicago did not have any eligible players, so they were starting from scratch. So given the hand that they were dealt, I think this is about as good as they reasonably could have been expected to do. They have 3 players in their starting lineup who are very established, with James Ignatowicz, Vivian David, and Callie Smith, and then we'll just have to see how Max Freeman holds up at this level. I gave them an A-. They got a few A+. The composite grade came in at an A-, and I'm putting them in the B tier. I was really close to having them in the C tier, but I went ahead and put them in the playoff picture. I gave the Columbus Sliders offseason an A+. Some of these other grades are just for the draft, remember, but considering all of the trades they made to acquire Andre Diescu, who, by the way, I'm just fully riding the hype train. The man has won 3 consecutive gold medals on the PPA Tour. He might be the best player on the planet right now. So I am giving that an A+ of an offseason to go acquire talent like that, plus pairing him with CJ Klinger. They get Paris Todd as well. They draft Leia Jansen. This team looks pretty good to me. The composite grade came in at an A-. And I'm putting them, this is crazy, maybe in the S tier for now. I think they're going to be a top tier team. Again, maybe I'm just too much into the Andre Diescu hype, but tell me if I'm wrong. Welcome home, Riley Newman, back to the DC Pickleball team. Now also, Jackie Kawamoto was on those teams when DC won a few events in 2023. So this is interesting. Deckelbar having an incredible 2024. If he can keep up that form, this team is going to be very dangerous. I think this is a playoff team that clearly got better just because James Ignatowicz wasn't really up to his full strength. They added Jackie Kawamoto. I gave this offseason an A. They drew pretty high marks across the board with 1 C from Todd Boss, who maybe doesn't like the Riley Newman pick in 2025. I am putting them in the A tier. They were a playoff team last year, losing in the first round of the playoffs, and I think they were probably looking to try to make the semifinals this year with that roster. Well, here we have my rivals, the Dallas Flash, who I do hate, by the way, and they drew high marks across the board, even though they didn't really do anything crazy. They are just going to run it back, and you can't blame them. They won it, so why not? The only thing I can maybe knock them for is there are other teams in the playoff picture or at the top of these power rankings that got better this offseason. Did the Dallas Flash get better? Well, it just depends on if the players they already had got better. Like I said, they drew high grades. I gave their offseason an A. The composite grade was an A-. And since they are the defending champs, even though, once again, I do hate them, I'm going to have to put them in the S tier. Now, I gave the LA Mad Drops an A. They added Quang Duong, so their starting lineup is the same 3 players that played most of their events last year: Catherine Parento, Jade Kawamoto, Hunter Johnson, and now Quang Duong into the mix. Thomas Wilson to IR, Wes Burrows filling in the sub role there. They got high marks across the board as well, drawing an A+ from the kitchen. Composite grade came in at an A. Hunter and Jade were very good last year. We'll see if Quang and Catherine, that's going to be a lot of fun to watch. So again, this is a team that was just outside the playoff picture last year. Despite the lack of roster continuity they had within the season last year, this is a team that got better. We're putting them into the B tier. This will be a playoff team. We have another recently promoted team from Challenger League to Premier. This is the Miami Pickleball Club. Now, in addition to the draft moves they made, they also traded Eric Onsens for Noe Cliff plus cash to the Texas Ranchers. This is an interesting move. Noe Cliff played for them last year. Also, he's already having a really hot start to the year. So that's a pretty good move for them if you aren't as high on maybe the upside or long-term potential of Eric Onsens. Jay DeVilliers, too. He's moving a little bit better now that he's recovered from his injury. Maya Bowie, I just don't know anything about her, so I did not feel comfortable giving this team higher than the D tier. I don't think they will be in the playoff mix. It's going to be tough for these promoted challenger teams. Now here we've got the New Jersey Fives, and we have another trade to talk about. They drafted Jeannie Bouchard, but they immediately announced they're sending her plus cash to the Phoenix Flames in exchange for Megan Dizon. This makes a lot more sense. Jeannie Bouchard next to Annalie Waters just doesn't really feel like the play. The draft grades are a little spotty here because, again, they came out before that trade was announced. We have a D, a few incompletes, an F from Kloss. But overall, I give their entire offseason a B+. I do like the Mari Humberg move. If she has to play on the left in women's doubles, That's just not a good fit with Anna Leigh. She is at her best when she's on the left, and you are building your franchise around Anna Leigh Waters, so you have to find a player that can play the right. They've done that. The men started to figure it out. I think this team is going to be just as dangerous as they were last year. So we've got them in the A tier. Now, I almost had them in the S tier instead of Columbus, but I don't know. It just felt a little spicier to put some new blood up there. All right, I'm going to get on my soapbox here because I gave the New York Hustlers a triple F minus. That doesn't even exist. I made it up specifically for them. Basically, they had a playoff team last year that took the eventual champs Dallas Flash to 3 games, and then they sold off all their players. They got about $600,000 in cash across all those transactions, and then they didn't use that money in the free agency draft. This is a franchise that clearly just is not committed to winning right now, and as such, I gave them a grade to reflect that. These players are all fine players. They could be good role players on a different team in a different situation, but together, I think it is going to be very tough sledding for this team. They had the lowest composite draft grades as well with a D-, and I have put them in the F tier. Now, I was the only one to give Orlando higher than a C+. I gave them a B, but again, taking the whole offseason into consideration, I love the trade they did to get Dylan Frazier and Lacey Schneemann. They still have Federico Staxford, who also has a very good claim to being the best player on the planet right now because, well, he's the #1 ranked player on the planet right now. They drafted Samantha Parker, who I'm just not sure how she's going to hold up. We'll see how that goes. I don't really know too much about her game, but ultimately this team came in at a C in the composite draft grades ranking, and I've got them in the C tier. I think they'll be in the playoff mix. It wouldn't surprise me if they are able to make it into the playoffs. We've seen Dylan and Fed play together too for the California Black Bears in 2023 season 1, but ultimately I do think they will come up short of the playoffs. Here we've got the Phoenix Flames, and again, we do have to take that trade into consideration. They have Jeannie Bouchard instead of Megan Dizon. Overall, I gave their offseason an F. Again, it's kind of the same thing as the New York Hustlers. They had Andre Diascu, and they sent him out for cash. They have Megan Dizon. They send her out for cash. They draft Jack Sock. They draft Jeannie Bouchard. Those players are very marketable. I'm just skeptical as to how many games they're actually going to win. Our composite grades came in at a C-. Klaus joined me in giving them an F, but I think that might just because he's not a big fan of Jack Sock. And I've put this team in the C tier. They maybe could have gone in the D tier. I don't know, but I do think that they have Tyson McGuffin, Jesse Irvin. That's enough veteran, proven players that could maybe win some matches. Plus Jack Sock, if he gets hot, and Jeannie Bouchard has been pretty good in singles lately, so there's at least something to work with here. We have the last of our recently promoted Challenger League teams, the SoCal Hard Eights, and I'm giving them a D for their offseason. Now look, they spent 31,000 points in the free agency draft. The minimum that they had to spend was 22,000 points. The only place they went above the minimum was to get their third man, Blaine Hovenier. They also could have kept Eric Lang, and he would have cost $0 to keep because they drafted him last year. That doesn't really make sense to me. I don't really think Irina in 2025, as good and as storied of a MLP career as she's had, is still a premier caliber player. She does bring a lot of intangibles, coaching aspects, but again, I just think it's going to be tough sledding for this team. And ultimately, I'm putting them in the E tier. Again, the F tier is just reserved specially for New York Hustlers. You really have to earn that tier, and I have them just a step below the other teams that I don't really think will be in the mix. St. Louis came up short in the semifinals against the eventual champs Dallas Flash last year, but they are still deciding to run it back, and I think that's a very good decision. The composite grades here come in at an A- with A's across the board, with the exception of Eric Tice from the Dink giving them a B-. And we talked about this too, where maybe they could have dropped Gabe instead, saved some money, but ultimately it doesn't matter. And hey, if you're a team that's willing to spend money to be competitive and get the players you want, I kind of reward that in my grades here. Now I've got the Shock in the A tier, and the reason I don't have them in the S tier is, again, until we see Gabe and Kate really put it together as a mixed doubles unit, I think that could just be the kind of one fatal lineup that holds this team back and keeps them from achieving their full potential. Here we've got my Texas Ranchers. I am the official armchair GM of the Texas Ranchers. Don't tell anybody I said that because it's not technically true. But anyway, we do have another trade here that we have to talk about. They sent Noe Cliff and cash for Eric Onsens. I like the Eric Onsens trade. I think it'll be fun. Now, if you're skeptical about it, remember, people were also very skeptical when GM Ryan DeWidgeon dropped Pablo Tejas and added Kwang Duong last year, but that move ended up working out all right for Texas. They made it to the semis. So once again, you're just going to have to trust the crystal ball on this one. Ryan DeWidgeon, he knows what he's doing. I gave this whole offseason a B+. The composite grades came in at an A-. However, that was mostly before this trade was announced. People did really like the Noah Cliff pick just because he's been playing so well lately. I get it, you know? I am putting Texas in the B tier. We'll see how Eric Onsons performs. I think there might just be a little bit of an adjustment period. We'll just have to see how Eric Onsons holds up in the Premier League, as this is his first time at this level. And last, we have the Utah Black Diamonds. I gave them a C. They had C+ in the composite grades here. They spent $50,000 on Mevish Safdar, who, once again, is just a new name for me. I can't really opine too much beyond that. Can this women's doubles unit find wins? We'll have to see. But I will say that Connor Garnett and Tyler Leung might be the most underrated men's doubles team in the entire league. And Connor Garnett and Alex Trong played really well towards the end of last season as well. So if the Safdar pick pans out, all of a sudden Utah might actually be in the mix a little bit. At the very least, they won't be in the very bottom tiers like we saw them for large stretches of last year. So that does it for my first power ranking tier list of the 2025 season. We'll be updating this as the season actually gets underway. Also, here's a quick look at the composite draft grades rankings. Again, remember the caveats, costed grades for each pick. These grades were also handed out before all the trades became public knowledge, and my grades are more reflective of the entire offseason. But still, again, it's just kind of fun to see what other people said. That's all the time we have for this video. Again, please like, please subscribe, drop a comment, let me know what you thought of this video. And as a reward for making it to the end, here's a few rec play clips of me playing this week.
Oh no! No way. Yes! Oh no! Good.